So in February, Julian Assange's defense team requested 9 different grounds for appeal. I believe it was 9. Each of these grounds of appeal are tied to a specific point in UK extradition law or European human rights law. But at the heart, what they were arguing was that Julian Assange was a journalist and that it violated who was being persecuted for exposing state criminality. He got the information from Chelsea Manning, a whistleblower, and that this was impermissible to extradite him to the United States. They raised a number of issues, from the fact that it would violate his free expression rights to be tried for his journalism for exposing war crimes, that it would be a political offense. And the UK-US extradition treaty is very clear. You cannot extradite someone for a political offense. And they also made a number of arguments about the fairness of the trial he would receive, that he might be prejudiced as a result of his nationality, and that he might face the death penalty. The UK judges heard these 9 arguments, and they rejected the vast majority of them as grounds for appeal. They found some very limited grounds for appeal. First, the lack of death penalty assurances. Under UK statutory law, you cannot be extradited if you will face the death penalty. Death penalty assurances are routine for the US because most of the world doesn't share our belief that governments can kill their citizens. So they have to, offer those types of assurances if they want to actually extradite people. The other 2 assurances came from comments that Gordon Kromberg, one of the lead prosecutors in the case, made. Kromberg is a notorious figure. He was involved in the Daniel Hale prosecution. He was involved in one of the many attacks on Sami al-Arian, a Muslim Palestinian civil rights activist who has since been deported from this country thanks to the government attacks on him. And he has a history of making really inflammatory anti-Muslim comments. I believe he's also a very sort of diehard Zionist who has a personal blog where he refers to the occupied Palestinian territory as Judea and Samara. And he just has a real history of making inflammatory remarks, which have led a lot of people to question why the US government lets him handle sensitive cases. He told the British courts in an affidavit that Assange would have a really fair trial in the US because he could challenge his indictment for violating the First Amendment, for violating the Fifth Amendment, saying the Espionage Act was too vague. And then he came in with, but of course, the US government wouldn't accept these arguments. And he listed, and this is where he made his mistake, he listed all of the areas where they would challenge them, including that Julian Assange, as a foreign national, might not be entitled to First Amendment rights, at least with respect to national defense information. And Julian Assange's legal team seized on this, and they said, if he can't rely on the First Amendment, that's a free expression violation, and he would be prejudiced as a result of his nationality. And these 2 UK judges couldn't find anything in violation of freedom of expression for prosecuting Julian Assange for exposing war crimes. They said all but 3 of the charges brought against him had no free expression nexus. That's, of course, not true. And of those 3 that did have free expression nexus, the information wasn't in the public interest to share. But in spite of that, they said if he can't have First Amendment rights as a foreigner, he would have his right to free expression violated, and he would potentially be prejudiced as a foreign national. So in May, they had a hearing on the assurances. I'm sorry, I need to back up. But they said he could appeal on those 3 grounds: death penalty, free expression, prejudice as foreign national, unless the US gave satisfactory assurances. And the US has been allowed to give assurances in this case before to basically short circuit the legal process in the UK and get rubber stamps. And they literally told the US what to say. So I thought they were going to just rubber stamp this again, but they had a hearing. The defense agreed that Julian Assange, the death penalty assurance was sufficient, but they argued about this assurance the US gave where they said he could seek to rely on the First Amendment, but the US government said only a court could decide what were the scopes of the First Amendment. And that's true. And they were a bit in a corner with that one, but they also refused to say that Kronberg wouldn't even raise this argument about being a foreign national. So it was a really hubristic thumbing of their nose at the British legal system, which, from my standpoint of having sat through these hearings and having watched it for 5 years, was ready and willing to rubber stamp the persecution of a journalist for exposing war crimes, but they just thumbed their nose at them over this last assurance. And we've learned from the Washington Post that the British lawyers who represent the U.S. didn't think they could win on this point. And at that point, they agreed to the plea deal. And I can talk more about what's in the plea, but I've been talking for a long time, and I want to let Kevin get a word in edgewise, as they say.
All right. Well, thank you for laying that all out, Chip. I'll go ahead and share where I was when I heard this news, because I had an opportunity to hop on a live stream with Chip after I was informed of this unbelievable development. I must stress that I didn't exactly think that Julian Assange would be walking out of Belmarsh prison this year or next year or the year after. My imagination, or my ability to think that we could create the scenario where he would be a free man, did not get to that point yet. And CIA whistleblower, former CIA officer John Kiriakou, gave me a phone call. Usually I call John Kiriakou because of who he was and who he has been, and invite him to come on a show and do a live discussion of developments with an Espionage Act prosecution or something related to government secrecy. He was calling me, and he was very serious. He said, "Have you seen the news?" And I was like, "What?" He says, "It's all over." "What's all over, John?" "Well, just look at it. It's everywhere." I thought somebody had died, but nobody was dead. And in fact, it was the opposite. Something remarkable had happened, and Julian Assange had been able to break free from the clutches of this US government and from, I believe, a security apparatus that would have been happy if he had died in prison. And we hopped on and did a quick reaction to it. And then I slowly processed what had taken place. And as I paid attention to the Assange legal team and their reactions, and then as we were treated to the reporting from the Washington Post based on insider sources, it became clear that this case had collapsed, that in fact, it's the fault of the US Justice Department that Julian Assange was free. We created the space. The global movement undoubtedly created a space for plea deal negotiations, but it became clear to me that the reason they were not pushing forward with an extradition, and the reason why they had offered such a favorable plea deal, which we'll get to those terms, is because they were now fearful of losing. There's an email that's referenced in this Washington Post report that says, "The urgency here has now reached a critical point." This is from a Justice Department trial attorney. "The case will head to appeal and we will lose." It doesn't get more evident than that. We overcame an unprecedented prosecution against Assange, and we'll get to the fallout, the aftermath. It's not some kind of kooky conspiracy theory that we're making up. We're not trying to do our own progressive left version of InfoWars here. We have a Yahoo News report that was put out by Michael Isikoff, Sean Naylor, and Zach Dorfman that dug into, they had conversations with over 30 people. They were former officials from the Trump administration. They were people who had a connection to US intelligence. Presumably some of them at some point worked in offices at the CIA. We're in a position to know that there were discussions led by former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, where war plans, it's called war plans, they were sketched out to try and target Julian Assange as part of a pressure campaign while he was living in Ecuador's London embassy under political asylum. And he was there from June 2012, I believe, to April 11th, 2019, when he was arrested, expelled, and the British police put him in a van and took him to Belmarsh prison. And we learn in this article that they are discussing plans to kidnap, even poison Julian Assange, and that they were willing to entertain the possibility of a rendition flight, basically, to try and get him outside of the embassy, put him on this plane, and bring him to the United States. That created a panic inside the Justice Department. They don't have indictments ready for Julian Assange, and they're wondering what charges they're going to bring exactly against him. And that spurs them to develop an indictment so that he doesn't arrive on the shores of the US at some point in need of an arraignment hearing. And then the Justice Department would be caught with their pants down and have no indictment against Julian Assange ready to go. This would be an extrajudicial act on the part of the United States.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.